Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast you don't want to miss. You're about to get a sneak peek at what goes on behind the scenes with authors. You'll find out their secret recipe for creating a book. We'll tell you where they get their ideas, and you'll get the inside scoop on their next project. Want to know more? Okay, we'll tell you where to find them on social media. Ready? All right, let's meet the author. Our guest today is award-winning author Peter Rush. Peter's here to talk about his novel, Wild World. He's a graduate of Brown University. He has a master's degree in creative writing from the University of Florida. His experience includes being a newspaper reporter, a magazine editor, a Peace Corps volunteer, and a police officer. Currently, he's CEO of a global management firm, and he's won 2 awards. The first one was the Independent Press Award for New Fiction, and the second was the Beverly Hills Book Award for Social Political Change and Northeast Regional Fiction. You won those in 2018. Peter, your credentials are amazing. Welcome to Books on Air.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Very happy to be here.
You know, your background, as I looked at this and I read the words and I read the different things that you've done, there's such a breadth of experience in your background. It made me curious. When did you actually begin writing?
I believe I began writing in high school. I was writing for the school newspaper at that time. I've always been a lover of books. I was voracious. We had a little public library that was probably 3 blocks from my house where I grew up out on Long Island. And so from the time I was around 7, I was allowed to walk down to the library and take out whatever books I wanted. And my father was a big reader as well, so he always encouraged it. And so telling stories was something I always wanted to do. Writing was something I always thought would be in my future. I didn't ever think I was going to make it professionally until after I tried a few things and I said, this is what I love to do. And so that's when I started writing.
I think that's so interesting. It's always amazing to me how people come to the field of writing because it's such an interesting, creative process. And you've done magazines, you've done newspaper reporting, and now you're doing fiction. How was that? That's got to be a totally different mindset.
Well, fiction is something that I always wanted to do. I realized early on, though, that making a living writing fiction was not going to be the easiest way in the world. Newspaper reporting, especially back in the days when there were newspapers, and there were a lot of daily newspapers, where you could get your writer's chops pretty quickly. You had to turn out 2 stories a day, usually on subjects you knew very little about or were not interested in, like the Traffic Commission. You had the old time editors who were pretty demanding. That you either wrote or you didn't have a job. So I started out at that right after graduate school because I'd gone to graduate school for creative writing, actually English, the degrees in English with a function as creative writing, and had an excellent teacher, a guy by the name of Harry Cruz, which some people who know Southern Gothic, he was quite popular in the 70s and 80s, and he was quite a character too. And we had quite a number of literary people come through the town as part of this program. So that's where I said, well, I think I can try to do this. And, after you get chopped up a few times in a class, you realize it's not as easy as you think it might be. And I got a job at the newspaper right out of graduate school. And so I started writing newspaper for a number of years. And I said, I really like longer form products. so that's where I moved to magazines. So I had sort of a longer form activity, a little bit more in-depth reporting. With that, I said if I was going to write, I should move to New York. So I moved back to New York, got myself a job at a publishing house as a magazine editor. Worked there a number of years. So I've always had my hand in it. Fiction came probably about 3 years ago, I said, or 4 years, I guess now, boy, time flies, that I really wanted to do this fiction project. This had been in the back of my mind for a lot of years. I knew there was a story there, and I did not have the right narrative thread. But when that came to me, I realized that I had lost some of the craft. I had to relearn it. I had to relearn just emphasize the idea of place, setting, and character, and having a story that had some, to me, a commentary on social and political situations, which when I was writing it, I had no idea that it would have as much relevance today as it did to when it happened, which was it was set in 1970. The opening scene begins with the killings at Kent State in Ohio, where students were killed by armed National Guards troops. A lot of things that people would not imagine could happen in America, but in fact it did.
Let's go ahead and give the listeners an overview of the book, because I really have so much that I want to talk to you about.
Well, the book is set in 1970. If people who were not alive at the time, or people who were and remember it, it was a time when the country was deeply divided. You had some people who loved the president and others who despised the president. There were riots in the streets and demonstrations, and it's not about what's happening today.
Sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah. It did happen in 1970. And so the book starts with a young college student who is confronted with the situation with Kent State, which was a shock to the system. And there's a love story here. He has a girlfriend. So the protagonist is named Steve Logan. His girlfriend is Roxy Fisher. And they're trying to figure out what to do about all this turmoil in America. And so they've gone to the protests. But Steve is challenged by a New York City police detective who is touring college campuses to talk about police and police work. And he challenged them to say, well, you can just protest, or you can actually try to do something. And you can only change the system if you engage and are part of it. And Steve takes that to heart and talks with Roxy. And between them, he decides that as he graduates, that he's going to do something. And he applies for the Providence Police Department. This is set in Providence, Rhode Island. So that begins the journey. And the journey takes him on a journey of discovery. It also challenges his relationship with Roxy. It challenges his sense of right and wrong, and when do you stand up, and what are the consequences of doing that, as well as how do you make choices when he realizes that as a police officer, he has a tremendous amount of power, which he never really thought about before.
You know, as I listened to you talk and as I read through the book, it just occurred to me how many different ways this book could be applied in an educational setting. Yes, it's fiction, but the events at Kent State happened. So having somebody in an English class perhaps read this novel and then take it to another level and say, okay, this is real history. So do some research and see what happened, what was the effect, why did it happen. You could also use it in a history class, even a class that teaches geography, where you could talk about where things are, where things happened, because this was basically in the Northeast. And so the country was flooded with this information. I remember I told you when we first started to talk, I was alive during this era as well. I'm not going to say how old I was, but I was alive during this era as well. And I do remember these events. I do remember the shock value, just like the news today. It's so funny because the parallel is so strong. I want to bring up your website because you have done such a magnificent job with your website. It is literally a treasure trove of information. Let's talk about what all is there. One of the things that I found so interesting was that you put an information in your blog about the role of 70s music. Tell me a little bit about that, Peter, because I thought that was really interesting.
Well, one of the things that I realized when I was starting to, as I was writing it, was music was extremely important to that generation. So actually the title of the book, Wild World, if you think of the Cat Stevens song.
Exactly.
Oh, baby, baby, it's a wild world.
Exactly.
That's where it comes from. The first chapter is For Dead in Ohio, which is actually a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song called Ohio. What's going on all along the Watchtower, Street Fighting Men. If you could read my mind, there is a song list on the website. It's a Spotify list, which is all music that was exactly contemporary to the time frame that this book was written in. One of the things that people don't recognize, certainly the younger generation doesn't recognize, is the music at that era was really the social media of the generation, because we didn't have Twitter and we didn't have Instagram and we didn't have Facebook, and there were only three major networks, and they covered the establishment. So music was passed around among the generation, and that's why so many of the songs from that time still resonate today. The Marvin Gaye song, which I'm hearing a lot more frequently right now, What's Going On? Listen to the words of that. The song by Quicksilver Messenger Service, What You Gonna Do About Me? There are a lot of things that were happening there, and it was just, yes, there was a generational issue. There was a protest against something that we felt was very unjust and was very personal, which obviously was the Vietnam War. But the book includes, there were racial issues going on there, and there was issues of police brutality, and there were issues of, quite frankly, the emergence of the feminist movement. So it was a very, very turbulent cultural mix that was going on. And there were a lot of exciting things about it. And if you think about it, as you read the book, I think you can see that not only is it a good read, it's a good read, it's a fast read, it captures historically, very accurately what was going on, but it's also a good love story.
Yes, I agree. And your writing style is very seductive. You pull the reader right in. You pull the reader right into the story, and they roll with the story. You just can't put it down. You're a very seductive writer. I really enjoyed that. I want to also talk about some of the other resources. Now, I mentioned education a few minutes ago, and I'm thinking partly about these parents right now who are dealing with their kids that are at home, and who knows what's about to happen. I mean, talk about a push and pull situation. Every day there's something new about, do we send the kids back to school? Do we not send the kids back to school? Do they do it online? And so parents are caught in a very interesting situation. If they have to do some of the education work at home, you have given wonderful educational resources on your website. Let's talk about some of those, because when I saw that you had resources, the first one, Sample Lesson Plan Curated by the New York Times, my gosh, what a jewel. I mean, I just looked at that and I thought, this is a fabulous piece of information. And then on the bottom of that same list, University of Houston Diversity Curriculum, college level, with group activities, games, and icebreakers. Tell me about these resources. How can people access them? Do they have to be a teacher? Could a parent, for example, access this for use at home?
Oh yes, all of the material here is publicly available. That's why I put it on my website. And you have to do a little research, and I mean, there are Q&As about the book, but you know, if you think about the historical context, and that's really where the book plays into any of those other resources. What was going on at the time? What was the conversation? Is that conversation that happened then is the antecedent to what's going on today? It wasn't. This is not the first time we've had protests. Not the first time there's been a generational clash. There's not the first time that there's a president who is deeply unpopular with a large segment of the population. And it's not the last time. This is part of the pull and push of democracy. And I think the key element of the book is that you can't be a passive bystander to it. That, you know, each individual makes a little mark one way or another. And one of the pieces, and it's as you read the book, Steve gets very involved on the police side in trying to change the system from within. Roxy is still on the other side, demonstrating against things. And they have that conversation of you're against something versus what are you trying to do to change it. And it's an interesting dynamic. It's an interesting dynamic today that protesting doesn't solve things because it's not building. However, protesting can encourage people to actually then get involved to do things.
I think it would be interesting as a just sort of a study for someone or for a group of people to sit down and actually put down a timeline and put down what happened when, and look at the two eras and the two series of events side by side with one another and sort of compare. These events actually act in my head as a crucible. They're things that are boiling around in there, and things will be changing as a result of what's happening now. So look at it and compare and think about what came out of all of the ideas that were going on in the 70s. What would you like to see come out of what's happening today? And I love the idea that you have the two characters who are together and that they are on opposite sides of this question, because I think that gives this a more smack of reality than it would have if it was just, two characters and they were both in agreement. I think this gives it it gives the book more depth and more sense of reality. I really like what you did with that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that's on your website, and let's give the address because I've forgotten to do that. Go ahead and give them the website address.
It's www.petersrush.com. So petersrush.com.
The other piece that I thought was very intriguing is that not only have you done resources for the educational element, but you also have web resources for students. How is that different from the resources that you've provided for educators?
Well, for students, I mean, it's in today's, I guess, academic environment, there's a lot more self-directed learning than there was where people sat in big lecture halls and you had to take notes and then you had to regurgitate. So when I was thinking about it is, these are thought starters. This is not the end. This is not the end of the learning that you would do. So if you go to the website and look at some of those directional questions, what do you know? What might spark your interest to dig a little bit deeper or to try another, set of issues around it? I mean, I on some of the, I put some of the albums on there, which actually tell stories as well. So it's, I really want people to be engaged in it as a discussion piece. Yes, it's a piece of fiction. It's a piece of literature. Hopefully it's a piece of literature. Not that I'm going to presume that, but the fact is that it's a provocative piece. It's not just a simple, feel good throwaway piece. I think you feel good after you read it, but I think also, especially in the context of today, is you will see a lot of things that will make you think slightly differently. There are this whole issue about police brutality. Steve has to confront that up front, face to face, having to confront other police officers and the public. And I think you get a different sense of what that is. And again, that was an era where, you hit first and then you ask what the problem was.
How does your insider knowledge, being a former police officer yourself, how does your insider knowledge of how police work actually works come into play in the novel?
I think the key thing is the realism of the scenes and the interactions, both among the police officers as well as the general public. And Steve learning that, the public, even his friends, started seeing the uniform first and the person second, which was disconcerting to Steve. At the same time, meeting in the general public, realizing that the uniform was really the thing that made the difference, and that was the authority it gave him. And once he realized that there was an authority that came with that, how do you deal with that? How do you handle it? Professionally? How do you keep your own moral compass when you have that kind of power? Especially when people around you perhaps don't have that same moral compass that you do. So you go through it with Steve as he wrestles with these questions, and put that in context with today, and you realize that these are still the same questions that have to be wrestled with by individuals.
I'm sitting here shaking my head as you're talking. I'm sure you can't hear me, but that's exactly what I'm doing. And it occurred to me as you were talking that if you have a student that reads the book and you have mother, father, maybe two parents that also read the book, there could be some interesting and intriguing multi-generational discussions around the themes that the book brings up, around law enforcement, about how all that works. And I think your insider knowledge is so valuable because it gives that police segment an insider look that we normally don't get. And I think that really contributes to the realism of what you're writing. You and I could just talk on and on and on because this is so interesting. And I'm sure that we have piqued the interest of our listeners. They're saying to themselves, where can I find this book? It's on Amazon, and I went to Amazon this morning to make sure that everything works, and it does. So if you go to the Amazon website. There's a search feature that's right at the very top. And I'll give you the name of the book, and I'll give you Peter's name so that you'll know exactly what to put in the search feature. The name of the book is Wild World by Peter, Peter, S. Rush, Rush. Now, Peter, it's available easily on Amazon, and so many people use Amazon, but often authors have books available in other outlets that they would like to talk about. Is Wild World available somewhere else besides Amazon?
Yes, it's available at Barnes & Noble, and it's available at your local bookstore. They may not have it in stock, but they easily can order it for you. And I'm a big supporter of local bookstores. They've been very good to me, allowing me to do some nice readings and getting to meet some nice folks around the country.
Are you doing social media? I believe you're on Facebook. Is that right?
Yes, I'm on Facebook, Peter S. Rush. I do put a variety of posts up there and link to a number of other writers if people would like to come search it out. I'm also going very active right now in terms of I have a new novel coming out. It'll be actually published in September called Young Americans, set approximately a little bit later in the 70s. Again, I use a song title here, if you think of the David Bowie song, that it follows one of the minor characters from this book into his journey in self-discovery while committing crimes.
Oh, you've got my attention already. That sounds intriguing. Maybe we can talk about this new book when it comes out. That sounds like fun. I have one question for you. I always think that it's very important for the author to have the last word about their book. Your book is intriguing on so many levels. When the reader metaphorically closes that back cover and finishes the novel and they're finished, what do you want them to take away from the book, Peter?
I want them to take away a sense of history and a little depth of, understanding of today's world. That, history does come in cycles, and it's still people who make up the world. And individuals have to do things, have to follow their own moral compass in order to make changes. And change is possible. There's a huge amount of change from 1970 to today. It's one of those metaphors of you have to look behind you to see how far up the hill you came. And it really is a big difference from then to now. And we're not at the end of the journey, but we are making progress. And I'm very, very optimistic about the future.
Well, this is such an intriguing novel. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I think we could talk for an hour about this book because there's so many things that we could explore. Thank you for being our guest today on Books on Air.
Suzanne, it's an absolute pleasure. Look forward to it, and it's www.petersrush.com.
Remember,
thanks a lot, Suzanne.
My pleasure. Remember that you can find Wild World by Peter S. Rush on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on iTunes as well as iHeartRadio. I'm Suzanne Harris, and I do hope you'll join our next Books on Air podcast because remember, you never know who will be here. It's the place to be. Thank you so much for listening.